I found out about the cheating at a moment when I wasn't supposed to know anything, because by all the laws of reality, I should have simply been asleep. And that's why this moment still feels wrong to me, as if I accidentally stumbled into a scene that wasn't meant for me at all. I was lying on the cold bathroom floor because I'd had too much to drink at the party my boyfriend was throwing, and at some point I started feeling sick. So I locked myself in there, turned on the water to wash my face, and just sat down next to the bathtub. And then, apparently, I blacked out. I only remember fragments: the noise of music from the other room, the heaviness in my head, the taste of alcohol that was already turning into nausea. I remember trying to get up and failing, so I just pulled the shower curtain toward me to shield myself from the light and people, in case someone came in. At that moment, I thought I was hidden, that no one would see me, and that I'd just sit for a couple of minutes, pull myself together, and go back out. But instead, I fell asleep. I didn't wake up all at once. It was more like I slowly returned to consciousness through the noise. First, I heard footsteps, then voices, then the sound of a door closing. I was still lying there, eyes closed, body heavy, and at first I didn't even understand what was happening. I just thought someone had come into the bathroom. That was normal, because at parties people are constantly going in there. I didn't move because I didn't want to be seen in that state. I just lay quietly behind the curtain and waited for the person to leave. But then I heard a second voice, and a second later I realized it was my boyfriend's voice. At that moment, I still hadn't opened my eyes. I just lay there thinking that he had probably come to check on me. That seemed logical. But then things went wrong, because the second voice was female, and I recognized that one too. It was his friend. That same friend he always said was just a friend. That same one he texted with almost every day, who was supposedly part of their old group. That same one he always spoke about calmly, confidently, even slightly irritated when I once asked if they talked too often. Back then, he said I was inventing problems that didn't exist, and I believed him. I lay behind the curtain and tried to force myself not to listen. I seriously tried. Because when you're already suspecting but still hoping, your brain does a strange thing. It starts looking for explanations that preserve your reality. I thought they had just come in to talk. Maybe it was quieter here. Maybe they needed to discuss something personal. Maybe they were looking for a first aid kit. Maybe anything. But then I heard a sound that couldn't be explained by logic. It was the sound of a kiss. I still didn't open my eyes. My heart started beating so fast that at some point I was afraid they would hear it. I lay there and tried to convince myself that I was wrong, that I'd imagined it, that it was some other sound, that I was still drunk and just confusing reality. But then it got worse. I heard their breathing. I heard them moving. I heard him laugh quietly with that voice he only used when he was completely comfortable. And then something inside me just stopped. I opened my eyes. I was still behind the curtain. They were standing literally a meter away from me, but they couldn't see me because the curtain was closed, because the light was off, because they didn't even think to check. And at that moment, I understood two things simultaneously. First, my boyfriend was cheating on me right now. Second, they thought they were alone. I lay absolutely motionless. My body seemed to stop existing. I couldn't move, couldn't say a word. I couldn't even breathe properly. Something strange was happening in my head. It wasn't like ordinary jealousy or anger. It was as if someone had suddenly turned off my entire life and switched on a different version of reality. I started remembering everything at once. All the moments when he said he'd be late, all the messages he answered too quickly, all the conversations about just friendship, all the times he said I was overthinking. I lay there and realized that I was now listening to proof that I'd been right all along. But at that moment, it didn't feel like victory. It felt like absolute humiliation. I don't know how long it lasted. Maybe 5 minutes, maybe 15. Time wasn't working normally at that moment. I just lay there and listened to my reality crumbling. The strangest thing was that they weren't even trying to be careful. There was no fear in their behavior, no tension. This was the behavior of people doing something familiar, and that thought hit the hardest, because it meant this wasn't the first time. At some point, they simply left the bathroom. I heard the door close. The music got louder again, and only then could I move. I slowly pushed the curtain aside. The bathroom was empty. I sat on the floor and tried to figure out what to do next. My first thought was to run out and make a scene, the second, to just leave, the third, to pretend I didn't know anything. But then came the fourth thought. If I go out now, they'll start lying. If I go out now, he'll start saying it's not what I think. If I go out now, I'll never know how bad things really are. And at that moment, something inside me broke completely. Because instead of leaving the bathroom and ending the relationship, I made a decision that forever changed who I became after that night. I decided to say nothing. I decided to find out everything. After that night, I decided to act as if nothing had happened. And it turned out to be much harder than I expected. Because every morning I woke up next to a person who calmly hugged me, asked how I was feeling after the party, brought coffee, and said ordinary things that used to seem like care but now sounded like a poorly played role. And the calmer he looked, the stronger grew the feeling inside me that I was living next to a person who had long ago learned to lie so naturally that he himself, perhaps, had stopped noticing the lie. For the first 2 days after the party, I just observed, trying not to ask unnecessary questions or change my usual behavior, because I needed to understand what his normal life looked like when he thought everything was under control. And that's when events from the past began to surface, events that had previously seemed like just strange moments, but now suddenly started forming a sequence that made me physically heavy. The first memory came almost immediately when I saw a bottle of wine left over from the party in the kitchen, because it reminded me of an evening about 3 months ago when we'd agreed to meet after work and have dinner together. And then at the last moment, he texted that a colleague had asked for help with some urgent project and that he'd be just a couple of hours late. And I hadn't even been offended then because these things happen. But later that same night, I accidentally opened a story on social media and saw a photo of that same friend, where he was standing in the background, and they were at a bar together with a couple of other people. And then I just decided it was a coincidence, that they'd met by chance or that a group had joined them that he'd forgotten to mention. And when I later asked how the evening went, he calmly told me about work, about being tired, about how he'd quickly eaten and immediately gone home, and I didn't even mention that photo because I didn't want to seem suspicious. But now, remembering this, I suddenly realized that back then, he had looked me in the eyes and told me a completely made-up story, and he did it without the slightest tension. The second moment surfaced a few days later when he was getting ready for a run and said he'd take the car because he wanted to get to a park farther from home. And at that exact moment, I remembered an incident from about 6 months ago, when we were already getting ready for bed. But suddenly he got a message after which he abruptly said he had to urgently go help a friend whose car had broken down. And back then it looked like a normal situation because friends sometimes help each other at night. But the strange thing was that he didn't return until morning. And when I asked if everything was okay, he said it had dragged on because they'd had to wait a long time for a tow truck. And I believed him then because I saw no reason to doubt. But now I remembered another detail. When he returned, he smelled of someone else's perfume, and back then I just decided it was the smell from the friend's car or from some bar where they'd been standing. But now that smell suddenly acquired a completely different meaning. The third event hit the hardest because it concerned me directly, and for a long time, I tried to convince myself that I'd simply misunderstood everything back then. It happened in winter when I was going through a difficult period at work and asked him to come home earlier because I was having a hard time and just wanted to spend the evening together. And then he said he already had plans to meet with friends. But if I was really feeling bad, he could cancel everything. And of course, I said there was no need to cancel anything because I didn't want to be the person who restricts someone else's freedom. And then he left. But about an hour later, I felt so bad that I decided to just text him that I'd actually be glad if he came back. And when I sent the message, he didn't respond for a long time, then wrote that he was already far away and that it would be difficult to return. And I said it was fine, that he should stay with his friends. But sometime later, I accidentally saw in a food delivery app an order placed from his account at a restaurant literally 10 minutes from our home. And when I asked about it the next day, he said he'd just stopped by there briefly before meeting his friends. And I believed him again because I didn't want to turn an ordinary conversation into an investigation. The heaviest moment was that all these memories started coming not one by one, but in whole chains. Because as soon as I remembered one strange episode, Another immediately surfaced, and gradually the picture became clearer and clearer because recurring elements appeared in it. Urgent meetings, unexpected plans, a phone that always lay face down, messages he answered too quickly or conversely, too slowly, and most importantly, his confidence that I would never check his words. But the real blow came a week after that party when we were sitting on the couch in the evening, and he suddenly said he was going out of town for the weekend with a group of friends. And of course, she was among those friends. And he spoke about it absolutely calmly, as if it were something habitual. And at that moment, I suddenly remembered one more thing that had previously seemed like just a funny coincidence. A few months ago, he'd already gone on a similar trip. And when he returned, he showed me photos from that day with the whole group. And then I noticed that in one of the photos, he was standing next to her, slightly closer than with the others, and their hands almost touched. But when I joked about it back then, he just laughed and said I was overthinking. And at that moment, I laughed along with him. Now, sitting next to him and listening to him calmly talk about the upcoming trip, I suddenly realized that this story might have been going on not for months, but much longer, and that night in the bathroom wasn't the beginning of the betrayal, but merely the moment when I accidentally saw part of a life that had existed parallel to ours. And it was that evening when I first felt not just pain, but deep humiliation, because it became clear that all this time I hadn't just been deceived, but had also participated in my own blindness, trusting a person who had perhaps long ago stopped considering my feelings as something important. And then I understood one simple thing that made it truly scary. If all this had been going on for so long, then I still didn't even know half the truth. After a week of constant memories and strange coincidences, I realized I could no longer just sit and watch, because the longer I stayed silent, the stronger grew the feeling that I was inside some story where everyone knew the truth except me. And that's when I had a thought that at first seemed stupid and even somewhat pathetic to me. But the longer I thought about it, the more logical it became. I decided to try to find out the truth not through him, but through her. I understood that she would never say anything directly, because people who participate in such stories usually know how to protect themselves with lies, just as well as the person they're meeting behind someone else's back. So I decided to do the only thing that seemed possible: create a new account and see what would happen if she started talking to someone who wasn't connected to this situation. I chose Instagram because it was the only network where she led an active life, constantly posting stories, photos, writing long captions, and communicating with people in comments. And that's where she had a circle of people she regularly corresponded with. I created a new profile, ordinary, maximally neutral, without strange details, with a few photos that looked plausible, and waited a couple of days so the account wouldn't look empty. All this time I felt strange because I'd never done anything like this before, and part of me said this was already looking like obsession. But another part reminded me that I'd already seen enough to stop thinking about the moral side of the question. I subscribed to her. A couple of hours later, she subscribed back. At first, everything was very cautious. I liked a couple of her stories. Then she reacted to one of mine, where I posted a photo of coffee and wrote something neutral about being tired after work. She just gave a reaction. A day later, I replied to one of her stories. She wrote briefly, then another reply, then another. It happened slowly but very naturally, because on the internet, people often start communicating exactly like this, with small reactions, random comments, and short phrases. After a few days, the conversation became longer. She started talking about work, about boredom, about how people around her sometimes irritated her. I responded calmly, without excessive interest, just kept the conversation going. And the more we corresponded, the more I began to notice one thing. She shared personal things very easily with a person she didn't actually know. Perhaps because she thought she was talking to someone completely outside this situation. Perhaps because she just needed someone to talk to. Then one night, the conversation unexpectedly became different. She wrote a long message about being tired of complicated relationships and sometimes feeling like a person living between two lives. I felt everything inside me tense up, because at that moment it became clear that the conversation might go where I hadn't even planned to take it. I cautiously replied that sometimes people find themselves in situations where everything becomes tangled. And then she started writing more. She said she'd been communicating with one person for a long time who was in a relationship, and that it had started as ordinary friendship, but then everything gradually changed. She wrote about it so calmly, as if it were an ordinary life situation, not a tragedy or drama, but just something complicated. She said at first they just texted, then started meeting more often. Then there were moments that could no longer be called just friendship. She said all this had been going on for almost a year. I reread this message several times because the word year rang in my head like a loud blow. She continued writing. She said that at first he told her his relationship would end soon, that they hadn't been real for a long time, that everything was just held together by habit. She said she hadn't wanted to believe this for a long time, but gradually he started spending more and more time with her. She wrote that sometimes it even seemed to her that he was living more with her than with his girlfriend, because he spent most of his time with her. After this message, I couldn't write anything for several minutes, because at that moment, the truth had ceased to be suspicion, it became a fact. I suddenly realized that all this time I hadn't just been a person being deceived. I had been the third person in a story where another reality had long existed. And the most humiliating thing was that in this reality, I had been discussed, justified, and explained as if I were just a temporary detail that would soon disappear on its own. And that's when something happened that I didn't expect for myself. I suddenly felt not pain, but cold calmness, because at that moment, something inside me changed completely. I no longer just wanted to know the truth. I started thinking about what to do with this truth. After that conversation on Instagram, I walked around for several days with the feeling that something inside me had completely restructured, because before I had lived between doubt and hope, but now I had facts. And the more I reread the correspondence, the clearer it became that the truth was much more unpleasant than I could have imagined, because it wasn't just about cheating, but about how calmly they both existed in this double reality, where I was just a person who could be discussed in the third person, justified, and at the same time continue living their life. But the strangest moment happened a few days later when our conversation with her again turned to this person. And then she wrote one detail that at first seemed to me just strange, but then gradually turned into an obsessive thought. She said he had a strange habit of keeping memories of their meetings. And at first I didn't understand what exactly she meant, because people often photograph certain moments of their lives, and that looks normal. But then she wrote that he had a flash drive at home where he stored photos from their meetings, and that they even had a kind of tradition. They sometimes celebrated anniversaries of certain moments, when everything began or when special meetings happened. She wrote about this with light irony, as if she herself understood it sounded a bit strange, but for them it had become something like a small ritual. And that's when she mentioned that recently they had celebrated the joint birthday of their story, as she called it, and that on that day he had shown her some old photos from that flash drive, because he liked keeping such things as a collection. I reread this message again and again, because I suddenly understood one simple thing. If this flash drive really existed, then there was evidence on it not only of that night I knew about, but of all the other meetings that had happened behind my back. And at that moment, a strange feeling arose inside me that could no longer be called just curiosity or desire to know the truth. It was something else. It was the feeling that I had to see everything through to the end, because only then could I finally understand how deep everything had gone. For several days, I tried to convince myself that I wouldn't do this, that this was too much, that normal people don't break into other people's homes for flash drives. But every time I thought about it, the same thought came to mind. This house had been my house for some time. I knew where the spare keys were. I knew which windows sometimes remained not fully closed. And most importantly, I knew that sometimes he would go away overnight to friends or stay over after parties. That evening, when everything happened, I knew he wouldn't be home. He wrote that he was staying at a friend's after some event. And before I wouldn't have even thought about it, but now this message looked like a perfect opportunity. I sat in my car near his house for a long time and tried to understand if I was really going to do what I had planned, because the closer the moment of decision came, the stronger I felt that I was crossing some line, after which I could no longer pretend that I was just a victim of the situation. But in the end, I still got out of the car. I walked around the house from the side where the bathroom was. There was a window that sometimes didn't close all the way because the mechanism had been sticking for a long time. And I knew this because I myself had once complained to him about that faucet and that window. Everything happened in complete silence, and every movement seemed louder than it actually was. I carefully pushed the window. It gave way almost immediately. It was dark inside. I slowly climbed through the windowsill and found myself in the bathroom. At that moment, I felt only tension and strange concentration, because I tried to move as quietly as possible, almost by touch, remembering the layout of things. I knew his computer and most of his things were in another room, so I carefully exited the bathroom and started looking for the desk where he usually kept various small items. It took me several minutes to find the flash drive. It was lying in a drawer with some wires and old chargers. When I took it in my hand, a feeling appeared inside me that I was holding something much bigger than just a small piece of plastic, because I understood that inside this device could be an entire parallel history of my life that I hadn't even suspected before. I was already getting ready to leave, and that's when everything went wrong. When I was going back through the bathroom, I had to climb through the window again, and because of the darkness, I moved very carefully, trying not to touch anything unnecessary. But at some point, my hand touched the faucet above the sink. I heard a quiet metallic click. At first, I didn't even understand what had happened. Then I heard the sound of water. It started flowing from the faucet right into the sink. I quickly tried to find the handle to turn it off, but in the darkness, everything was happening too clumsily, and at some point, I accidentally turned it even more. The flow of water became louder. I felt panic, because I understood that every extra second could attract the attention of neighbors or someone on the street. I tried to close the faucet again, but my hands were shaking, and at some point I realized I was just wasting time. At that moment, some primitive instinct kicked in. Get out as quickly as possible. I climbed back out through the window. When I was already outside, I heard the water continuing to flow inside the house. For a second, I thought about going back and finally closing the faucet, but then imagined how much time it could take and how easily I could be noticed. I closed the window and left. Already in the car, I sat for several minutes trying to calm my breathing. The flash drive lay in my hand. Then I still didn't understand what exactly had happened inside the house. But a couple of hours later, I received a message. He wrote that a catastrophe had happened to him, that a pipe had burst in the bathroom, that he had returned and discovered that half the house was flooded. I read this message and felt a strange mixture of emotions, because this wasn't planned. I hadn't come there to destroy anything. I just wanted to take the flash drive. But the fact remained. While I was looking for evidence of his cheating, I accidentally caused him a real catastrophe. And for the first time during all this, a thought appeared inside me that sounded almost calm. Perhaps this was the most honest form of revenge. After that night with the flash drive and the water, a strange feeling of completion appeared inside me, although I perfectly understood that formally nothing had ended yet, because our relationship still existed. We still saw each other. He still wrote me messages, and outwardly our life looked almost the same as before. But in reality, everything had been destroyed to the foundation. And the more time passed, the clearer I understood that there was no way back, even if he never found out that I knew the truth. For the first few days after that story with the flooded house, he wrote to me almost constantly, telling me what had happened, complaining about the ruined floor, the broken furniture, about how much everything would have to be repaired. And every time I read these messages, a strange feeling arose inside me, because part of me understood that this had happened because of me, but another part felt neither remorse nor desire to fix anything, because against the background of what I had learned about his double life, this incident seemed almost symbolic, as if some force had simply decided to intervene and destroy that carefully constructed system of lies in which he had lived for so long. I only opened the flash drive 2 days later. I hesitated for a long time to connect it to the computer, because I understood that after this, I would no longer be able to pretend that I didn't know the whole truth. When I finally did it, a folder with dates appeared on the screen. Inside each folder were photos. I didn't look at them for long. A few seconds were enough for me to understand that everything she had told me in the correspondence was true. There were photos from different days, from different places, And the most unpleasant thing wasn't that they existed, but how systematic it all looked, because it really did create the feeling that he was collecting a collection of moments that existed parallel to our life. I closed the folder and never returned to it. At some point, I had the thought to do what people often write about on the internet when they want to expose someone's cheating. I thought about anonymously posting the photos. Not all of them, just a few, enough for people to start asking questions. I even imagined how it might look. An anonymous post, hints, people start discussing who's in the photos. Then someone recognizes him, and gradually his calm and careful reputation begins to crumble. This idea spun in my head for several days, because at that moment it seemed to me that justice should look exactly like this, publicly, loudly, so that he would feel at least part of that humiliation I had experienced. Lying behind the curtain in the bathroom and listening to two people discuss my life as if I didn't exist at all. But the longer I thought about it, the more I understood one thing. His life had already started falling apart without my help. The flooded house had turned into a huge problem. He constantly wrote that the repairs would cost much more than he expected, that the insurance company was asking strange questions, that some things couldn't be restored at all. And every time we met, I noticed one more detail that at first seemed like a small thing, but gradually began forming a strange picture. He was constantly looking for something. Sometimes it looked like ordinary absent mindedness. He might suddenly start checking pockets, looking in bags, opening drawers. Sometimes he would take his phone and scroll through old messages as if trying to remember something. Once I noticed how he sat in front of his laptop for several minutes, just looking at the screen with an expression I'd never seen on him before, a mixture of irritation and anxiety. Then I first thought that he might be looking for the flash drive. He never directly said anything about it, but the tension became more and more noticeable. Strange pauses began appearing in conversations. Sometimes he asked me questions that sounded too random to be random. For example, once he suddenly asked if I had taken any of his things when I was at his house last. I calmly said no, and at that moment he looked at me attentively, as if trying to understand if I was telling the truth. That look lasted only a couple of seconds, but I understood that he already suspected something. At some point, I caught myself thinking that I was living next to a person who now also felt that his reality was beginning to crack. The irony of the situation was that he still didn't know which part of the truth I knew, but already felt that something had gone wrong. Our breakup happened without a big scene. I just said that I no longer felt like part of this relationship. He tried to talk about how we could fix everything, that we were just going through a difficult period, that these things happen to all couples. He spoke calmly, even somewhat tiredly, as if sincerely believing that this was an ordinary crisis that could be survived. I listened and understood that he still didn't know how far everything had gone. I didn't tell him about that night in the bathroom. Didn't say anything about the fake account, didn't say anything about the correspondence, and certainly didn't say anything about the flash drive. I just left. After that, we hardly communicated. Sometimes he wrote something short, sometimes asked how I was doing, but these messages became rarer. The last time I saw him by chance, a few weeks later, he looked like a person who was constantly thinking about something. He was looking for something in his bag again, then checking his phone, then returning to the bag again. And at that moment, I suddenly understood that I wouldn't post any photos. Not because I forgave him, and not because I was scared, but because revenge had already happened. It happened strangely, accidentally, and not as I had planned. I wanted to destroy his reputation with an anonymous post, but in the end, part of his life was destroyed, and it happened because of a simple mistake in a dark bathroom, when my hand touched the faucet. I don't know if he's still looking for that flash drive. Don't know if he ever understood that it had disappeared. And sometimes I think about the strange moral side of this whole story, because formally, I never exposed him, never made a scene, and didn't even tell him the truth. But somewhere deep inside, I know that the accidental water that flooded half his house perhaps said much more than any anonymous post on the internet.